A plantation daughter stands in the morning dust, while her mother's voice cuts sharp as a whip crack. The family name hangs in the balance, all they have left between respectability and ruin. But when iron chains rattle and a wagon waits at the gate, when forged papers bear a seal that doesn't match the ring on her finger, she faces an impossible choice. The neighbors watch from their carriages. The preacher grips his Bible. Thunder rolls across the sky. In front of God and everyone who matters, she lifts her face and kisses the man they're dragging away, shattering every rule she's ever known. But a sharp-eyed child spots something wrong with the sale papers. A storm floods the river crossing, and hidden in an old quilt lies a secret that could change everything. When the truth comes to light and the courthouse steps fill with witnesses, what matters more, a family's reputation or a love worth dying for? The kindling crackled in Lila's thin arms as she stepped through the kitchen doorway, her bare feet silent on the worn boards. Dawn light slanted through the window, catching dust motes that danced like secrets in the air. She hummed low, a hymn that rolled from her throat without thought, the way water runs downhill. "Hush that noise, child," whispered Cook, though her voice held no sting. The old woman's hands never stopped, their work flour to meal, meal to batter, batter to the black iron pan that would feed the house. But her eyes darted toward the door where voices carried from the yard. Lila set the wood by the hearth and moved closer. Through the crack in the door, she could see old Benji leaning heavy on his walking stick, shaking his grey head at something the overseer had said. "Mr." Silas stood with his thumbs hooked in his vest, talking low to a man Lila had never seen before. A patroller, she reckoned, from the rope coiled at his belt and the hard set of his jaw. "Taxman been sniffing round again," Benji was saying, his voice no more than a whisper meant for Cook's ears alone. "And that overseer? He been writing in his ledger book more than usual, making marks that don't look right to these old eyes." Cook's wooden spoon stopped stirring. "What kind of marks?" "The kind that turn people into numbers," Benji said. "The kind that make folks disappear when debts come calling." Lila's fingers found the blue ribbon tied at her wrist, a strip of sky-colored silk that Isaiah had given her on her last birthday. She traced its smooth edge while her ears caught every word, storing them away like seeds in fertile ground. That was her gift, remembering. Every hymn, every whispered conversation, every letter she'd seen traced in the margins of the Master's big Bible. The men outside moved toward the barn, their boots marking time on the packed earth. Lila slipped through the door and followed, keeping to the shadows cast by the morning sun. She had learned long ago how to make herself small, how to listen without being seen. In the stable, dust motes spun lazy spirals through shafts of golden light. The horses shifted in their stalls, leather creaking, hay rustling under their hooves. Caroline Harrow stood before a chestnut mare, her pale blue dress a splash of color against the weathered wood. Her hand rested on the horse's neck, fingers tracing the same spot where Isaiah's hand had been just moments before. "She's still skittish around strangers," Isaiah said, his voice soft as the brush strokes he drew across the mare's flank. "But she trusts you." Caroline's fingers lingered on the warm coat. "Because you taught her to." The space between them hummed with words unspoken. Lila pressed herself against the barn wall, watching through a gap between the boards. She had seen this dance before, the way Caroline found reasons to visit the stable, the way Isaiah's eyes followed her movements like a man watching sunrise. She had witnessed the careful distance they kept, the way their hands never quite touched, except through the gentle bodies of the horses they both loved. "Do you remember?" Caroline said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That day thunder ran wild, when the snake spooked him in the pasture?" Isaiah's brush stilled. "I remember. You could have been killed, throwing yourself between us like that. Couldn't let nothing happen to you, Miss Caroline. Not then. Not ever." The words hung in the air like hymn notes fading in a church. Caroline turned to face him, and Lila saw something pass between them, a recognition, a longing, a truth too dangerous to speak aloud in a world where such truths could cost a man his life. "Isaiah," Caroline began, but footsteps on the barn floor cut her short. Mrs. Harrow appeared in the doorway, her black mourning dress crisp despite the morning heat. Her eyes swept the scene, her daughter standing too close to the enslaved man, the intimacy of their shared space, the guilt that colored Caroline's cheeks like rouge. "Caroline," she said, her voice sharp as the crack of a whip. "Come, now." Caroline stepped back from the mare, her hand falling to her side. "Yes, Mama." But as she passed Isaiah, her fingers brushed his for just a moment so brief that anyone else might have missed it. Anyone except Lila, who caught the small rebellion in that touch, the promise it held and the danger it courted. Mrs. Harrow's eyes narrowed. She had seen it too. Sunday morning brought the scent of beeswax and hymn books to the small country chapel. Lila sat in the back with the other enslaved folk, her voice blending with theirs as they sang of Jordan's banks and promised lands. In the front pews, the white families sat straight-backed and proper, their voices carrying the melody while darker voices wove harmony underneath. Caroline sat beside her mother, her gloved hands folded in her lap, but Lila could see the way her eyes drifted toward the window, toward the road that led back to the plantation, toward the stable where Isaiah worked even on the Lord's Day. When the service ended, the congregants spilled into the yard like water from a broken dam. Neighbor spoke to neighbor, sharing news of crops and weather, of politics and prices. Mrs. Harrow stood in a circle of women, accepting their condolences for her husband's death with the practiced grace of a woman born to manage appearances. "Caroline spends a powerful lot of time in that stable," said Mr. Whitmore, loud enough for half the yard to hear. He owned the plantation to the west and had buried 3 wives without siring a son to inherit it. His eyes fixed on Caroline like a hawk watching a field mouse. "Seems to know those horses better than most men do." Nervous laughter rippled through the group. Mrs. Harrow's smile froze on her lips. "My daughter has always had a way with animals," she said, her voice carefully level. "Her dear father taught her to appreciate good breeding." "In horses, certainly," Whitmore replied with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "though I wonder what other influences she might be absorbing in that stable." The silence that followed was thick as summer honey. Caroline's face burned crimson, but she kept her eyes down, her hands clutched tight in her skirts. Reverend Pike cleared his throat. "Brother Whitmore, perhaps we should speak of more suitable matters on the Lord's Day." "Of course, preacher." No harm meant. But Whitmore's grin lingered, and his meaning hung in the air like smoke from a green wood fire. That evening, as the sun painted the sky red above the plantation house, Mrs. Harrow found Caroline on the front porch. The last of the Sunday visitors had departed, their carriages rolling down the dirt road in clouds of dust. The preacher still sat in his buggy by the gate, checking his pocket watch and gathering his reins. Mrs. Harrow took Caroline's arm, her grip firm as iron. "Walk with me." They descended the porch steps, their feet marking time on the worn boards. Mrs. Harrow's hand trembled slightly, but her voice was steady as stone. "That man's words today," she said. "They were not idle talk." "I know, Mama." "Do you, Mrs.?" Harrow stopped walking and turned to face her daughter. "Do you understand what our name means in this county, what your father built with his hands and his reputation?" Caroline's eyes drifted toward the stable, where lantern light spilled through the cracks between the boards. "I understand. I don't think you do, Mrs." Harrow's voice rose just enough to carry to where Reverend Pike still sat in his buggy, close enough to hear but pretending not to listen. "I think you've forgotten that we have precious little left but our standing in this community, that without our name, we are nothing." Lila crept closer from the shadow of the house, drawn by the tension in Mrs. Harrow's voice. She pressed herself against a pillar and listened. "Your father is dead, Caroline. The debts he left behind could swallow this place whole. All that stands between us and ruin is the respect of our neighbors." Mrs. Harrow's fingers dug into Caroline's arm. "And you would throw that away for what? For some foolish fancy born of loneliness and grief?" Caroline tried to pull away, but her mother's grip held fast. "Don't you dare kiss a slave," Mrs. Harrow hissed, her voice pitched low but carrying clear in the still air. "Think of our name." The words hung between them like a curse spoken over bread and salt. Reverend Pike's buggy creaked as he shifted in his seat, his ears sharp as a hunting dog's. From the stable came the soft sound of Isaiah's voice, calming a restless horse. Caroline met her mother's eyes. "Our name, Mama? Or our pride? They are the same thing, child, and you would do well to remember it, Mrs." Harrow released her daughter's arm and swept back toward the house, her skirts rustling like autumn leaves. Caroline stood alone on the steps, her hand pressed to where her mother's fingers had gripped her. From the shadows, Lila watched and remembered every word. The next morning broke grey and heavy, with storm clouds massing on the horizon. Lila woke to the sound of wagon wheels on the drive and men's voices raised in argument. She slipped from her pallet and padded barefoot to the window of the slave quarters. Two men stood before the main house, Mr. Silas, the overseer, and the hard-faced patroller from the day before. Between them sat a wooden crate, and beside it lay papers weighted down with stones against the rising wind. Missus. Harrow appeared on the porch, her wrapper pulled tight around her shoulders. Behind her came Caroline, still in her nightdress but alert as a cat, scenting danger. "This is highly irregular," Mrs. Harrow was saying, her voice shrill with fear and confusion. "Those papers were never signed. My husband made no such arrangements before his death." The patroller Jed, Lila heard Silas call him, spat into the dust. "Papers are legal and proper, ma'am, signed and sealed according to law. Your husband made provision for his debts before he passed. God rest his soul." Silas nodded, his face a mask of false sympathy. "I know it's hard to accept, Mrs. Harrow, but the law is the law. The boy and his sister are spoken for. Bills must be paid." "What boy?" Caroline stepped forward, her bare feet white against the dark porch boards. "What bills?" "Isaiah and the girl," Silas said, pointing toward the slave quarters where Lila still pressed herself against the window. "Sold to cover the tax debt on the west 40 acres. All legal and proper." Caroline's face went white as milk. "You can't. They're not for sale." "Afraid they are, miss." Jed pulled a paper from his coat and held it up for all to see. Red wax gleamed on the seal, and black ink marked heavy lines across the page. "Bill of sale, signed by your father before his death. $200 for the pair, payment in full for outstanding taxes." Mrs. Harrow swayed on her feet. Never. He never told me. Men don't always tell their wives about business matters," Silas said smoothly. "But the papers don't lie. Come dawn, they travel south to their new master." Lila's heart hammered against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. She had to find Isaiah, had to warn him. She slipped from the quarters and ran toward the stable, her feet flying over the dew-wet grass. She found him in Thunder's stall, curry comb in hand, working oil into the horse's coat with long, sure strokes. His face was peaceful in the lamplight, unaware of the storm breaking over the house. "Isaiah," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "They coming for us." The comb stilled in his hand. "Who's coming, little sister?" "The patroller man and Mr. Silas. They got papers, say we been sold." Tears made tracks down her cheeks. "Say we going south come morning." Isaiah set down the comb and pulled her close, his strong arms a shield against the fear that threatened to swallow her whole. "Papers can lie, Lila. You know that, but they got a seal on them, red wax with a mark pressed in it." She pulled back to look at his face. "Only, Isaiah, it ain't the right mark." "What do you mean?" Lila closed her eyes and called up the memory that lived bright and clear in her mind. "Master Harrow's ring, the one Miss Caroline wears now. It got a little bird on it, wings spread wide, and a notch in the metal, right at the bird's head, where he dropped it on the hearthstones last winter." She opened her eyes. "The wax seal on that paper got a bird too, but no notch, and the wax is bright red, like fresh blood. Master Harrow always used dark red wax, the color of old roses." Isaiah stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Girl, you just might have saved us all." By the time they reached the house, chains already bound Isaiah's wrists. Jed held the other end of the rope, his face hard as flint. Caroline stood between them and the wagon, her nightdress whipping around her legs in the rising wind. "This is wrong," she said, her voice carrying across the yard to where house slaves and field hands had gathered to watch. "My father would never have done this. Your father did what he had to do," Silas said. He nodded to Jed, who jerked Isaiah toward the wagon. "Time to load up." Lila broke from the group of watchers and ran to Isaiah's side. Her small hands caught his chained ones and held tight. "Don't go," she whispered. "Please don't go." Jed shoved her away with the back of his hand. She stumbled but kept her feet, her blue ribbon bright as hope against her dark skin. "Get in the wagon, boy," Jed growled. "And you too, girl. No more delays." Isaiah looked across the yard to where Caroline stood frozen, her mother's hand heavy on her shoulder. Their eyes met and held, and in that moment Lila saw the truth pass between them, the love they had never dared speak, the future they would never share, the goodbye that tasted like ashes in the mouth. Caroline pulled away from her mother's grip. She walked toward Isaiah with slow, measured steps, her bare feet carrying her through the red dust and scattered hay. The watchers fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Mrs. Harrow's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Caroline, come back here this instant." But Caroline kept walking. She stopped before Isaiah, so close that Lila could see the tremble in her hands, the tears that caught the lamplight like scattered stars. "Don't you dare, Mrs. Harrow screamed, her voice breaking on the words. "Think of our name." Caroline reached up and cupped Isaiah's face in her palms. Her thumbs traced the line of his cheekbones, memorizing the shape of him. Then she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his, long and deep and desperate, in full view of God and man and the devil himself. The kiss lasted forever. It lasted no time at all. When she pulled away, her eyes blazed with the light of a woman who has chosen her path and will not be turned from it. "I have thought of it," she said, her voice carrying clear across the yard. "And I choose love instead." Jed jerked Isaiah backward, his face twisted with disgust. "That's enough of that foolishness. Time to go." But as they dragged Isaiah toward the wagon, Lila caught Caroline's hand. "Miss Caroline," she whispered, "the seal." "It ain't right." Caroline looked down into the child's face, seeing the bright intelligence that lived there. "What about the seal, Lila?" "It ain't Master Harrow's mark. The wax is wrong, and the bird got no notch." Lila's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "That paper's a lie." Understanding dawned in Caroline's eyes like sunrise breaking over water. She squeezed Lila's hand once, quick and sure. Then she turned toward the house, her nightdress streaming behind her like a banner of war. Mrs. Harrow stood on the porch, her face white with shame and fury. "You've ruined us," she said, her voice hollow as a bell with a cracked rim. "Ruined our name, ruined our standing, ruined everything your father worked to build." Caroline climbed the steps and stood before her mother, chin lifted like a queen facing execution. "Then let it be ruined," she said. "Some things matter more than names." Behind them, the wagon rolled down the drive with Isaiah chained inside it and Jed walking alongside, whistling a tune that sounded like mockery in the growing dark. But Lila pressed her ribbon to her lips and smiled, because she knew something the patroller didn't. The truth had a way of coming to light, like seeds pushing through winter soil toward spring. Caroline found herself in the plantation office before dawn, her father's papers spread across his desk like fallen leaves. The old clerk, Mr. Thorne, sat hunched over the ledgers, his finger tracing columns of numbers that told the story of debt and desperation. "Tell me about the seals," Caroline said without preamble. "How my father marked his papers." Thorne looked up, his rheumy eyes sharp despite his years. "Your father was particular about such things. Had that ring of his, the one with the bird crest, always pressed it into dark wax, the color of dried blood. Said it reminded him that every signature cost something." Caroline held up her hand, where her father's ring caught the lamplight. The tiny notch in the metal was barely visible, a flaw that marked it as surely as a scar marks flesh. "Would you recognize his seal, if you saw it?" she asked. "Child, I helped him press 1,000 such seals. I could spot his mark in a haystack." Thorne's voice grew troubled. "Why do you ask?" Caroline pulled the bill of sale from her coat. She had snatched it from the crate before Jed could stop her. She spread it on the desk between them. Thorne studied the paper for a long moment, his finger hovering over the red wax seal. Finally, he shook his head. "This isn't his work." "You're certain?" "As certain as sunrise. The wax is wrong, the pressure is wrong, and see here." He pointed to the impression in the wax. "No notch in the bird's head. This seal was made from a different ring altogether." Caroline's heart leaped like a fish jumping clear of water. "Then the sale is fraudulent." "Appears so. But proving it." Thorne's voice trailed off into uncertainty. "That's another matter entirely." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. "Reverend?" Pike stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, and his face grave with concern. "Miss Caroline, I heard about the events of yesterday." "I've come to offer what help I can." Caroline gestured him inside. "Mr. Pike, did my father ever speak to you about manumission, about freeing Isaiah and Lila?" The preacher's eyebrows rose. "Not in so many words, but there were conversations. Times when he asked me to sing certain hymns with particular meanings." Pike set his hat on the desk. "Your father was a complicated man, Caroline. He struggled with the institution he inherited, even as he depended on it for his livelihood." "What kind of hymns?" Thorne asked, leaning forward with interest. "Coded songs, spiritual music that carried messages beyond their surface meanings." Pike's voice dropped to a whisper. "There was one hymn in particular he favored. Something about hidden treasures and sealed promises. He asked me to sing it the week before he died." Caroline felt her pulse quicken. "Do you remember the words?" Pike closed his eyes and began to sing, his voice low and melodious. "Where the porch beams meet the cornerstone, where the hidden rings in wax are sewn, seek the seal in blood and wine so deep, promises that faithful hearts will keep." "Lila mentioned that verse," Caroline said, excitement building in her chest. "She said she heard my father singing it the night before he died." "The child has a remarkable memory," Pike observed. "I've heard her repeat entire sermons word for word." Thorne cleared his throat. "If your father did make provision for manumission, there would be records, legal documents. He was too careful a man to leave such things to chance." "But where?" Caroline asked. "I've searched his papers, his desk, his strongbox." "Not necessarily in the house," Pike said thoughtfully. "Your father came to see me several times in his final months. Brought his Bible, made notes in the margins during our conversations, said he was settling accounts with the Lord." Caroline's breath caught. "The Bible, of course. Lila said she saw him writing in it, the night he asked for that hymn." The three of them moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward the small country church, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the gloom. The building stood empty and cold, its windows dark as closed eyes. Pike produced a key and led them inside, their footsteps echoing off the plank floors. In the basement, among dusty boxes of hymnals and church records, they found what they were looking for. The Harrow family Bible lay open on a small table, its pages yellowed with age and heavy with use. Caroline approached it with trembling hands. "There," Pike said, pointing to a passage in Leviticus. That verse he marked so heavily. Caroline read aloud, "And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." In the margin beside the verse, written in her father's careful script, were the words that made her heart sing. "Isaiah Thomas and Lila Thomas, born to Sarah Thomas of the Harrow plantation, to be freed upon my death, as is right in the sight of God. See copy held in the quilt binding by Sarah's own hand. William Harrow, November 1854. "A hidden manumission clause," Thorne whispered. "Hidden but legal." Caroline looked at Pike and Thorne, hope blooming in her chest like spring flowers after winter. "We have to find that quilt." They reached the slave quarters as the sun climbed above the trees, painting the sky pink and gold. The small cabins stood silent, their inhabitants already gone to the fields or the big house. But Aunt Dinah sat on her porch, shelling peas into a wooden bowl. "Miss Caroline," she said, rising with the careful movements of age, "what brings you to the quarters so early?" "We're looking for something that belonged to Isaiah's mother," Caroline said. "A quilt she made before she died." Dinah's eyes sharpened. "Sarah's quilt. Child, why you want that old thing? It may contain something important, something that could help Isaiah and Lila." Dinah studied Caroline's face for a long moment, reading the desperation written there. Finally, she nodded. "Come on, then. It's in my cabin. Been keeping it safe since Sarah passed." Inside the small, neat cabin, Dinah pulled a wooden trunk from beneath her narrow bed. She lifted out a quilt of blue and white patches, the colors soft with age and handling. The stitching was fine, and even, each piece joined with care and skill. "Sarah worked on this quilt every night by lamplight," Dinah said, her voice heavy with memory. "Said it was for her babies, to keep them warm when she wasn't there to do it herself." Caroline ran her hands along the quilt's edges, feeling for anything unusual. Near the bottom corner, her fingers found it a stiff patch where paper had been sewn between the layers of fabric. "Here," she said, her voice tight with excitement. "Thorn, your knife." The old clerk produced a small blade, and Caroline carefully cut the stitching. The thread parted like spider's silk, and she slipped her fingers inside the opening. The paper that emerged was folded small and yellow with age, but the writing was still clear. It bore her father's signature and seal, the true seal, with the notched bird crest and the same dark red wax that Thorn remembered. Pike read aloud, "Know all men by these presents that I, William Harrow, do hereby manumit and set free my servants Isaiah Thomas and Lila Thomas, children of Sarah Thomas, upon the occasion of my death, as is just and right before Almighty God. Signed this day, November the 15th, in the year of our Lord 1854. Caroline pressed the paper to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "We have them," she whispered. "We can prove the sale is false." Dinah reached out and touched Caroline's hand. "Child, you sure you want to do this? Once you start down this road, there ain't no turning back. Folk in this county don't take kindly to freed slaves, especially ones that been made free by a white man's conscience." Caroline met the older woman's eyes. "I'm sure." The county clerk's office smelled of ink and dust and the sweat of men who worked with papers instead of plows. Mr. Mallory sat behind his desk, spectacles perched on his nose, examining the documents Caroline and Pike had brought. "This is highly irregular," he said for the third time, his thin voice expressing the depths of his discomfort. "A bill of sale executed by the overseer, a manumission clause hidden in a family Bible, accusations of forgery." He set the papers aside and removed his spectacles to clean them. "These are serious matters, Miss Harrow, not to be undertaken lightly." "I understand the gravity of the situation," Caroline said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I'm asking you to examine the evidence and make a determination according to law." Mallory picked up the forged bill of sale and held it to the light. "The seal does appear different from your father's usual work, less precise in its impression." "Because it was made with a different ring," Caroline said. "A crude copy of my father's seal, designed to fool a casual glance but not a careful examination." The clerk set the paper down and looked at Caroline with something approaching sympathy. "Even if I were to rule in your favor, Miss Harrow, there's the matter of enforcement. The slaves have already been removed from your property. Finding them, retrieving them." He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. "Then rule first," Pike said firmly. "Let justice be done, and trust Providence to provide the means of enforcement." Mallory considered this for a long moment, the tick of his pocket watch loud in the silence. Finally, he dipped his pen in ink and began to write. "I will record my preliminary findings," he said. "Based on the evidence presented, there are reasonable grounds to question the validity of the bill of sale executed by Overseer Silas Wickham. A formal hearing will be held 3 days hence to determine the matter fully." He looked up at Caroline. "That gives you time to locate the affected parties and bring them before this court for proper disposition." Caroline's heart soared. "Thank you, Mr. Mallory, thank you." "Don't thank me yet, child. Justice and law don't always walk the same path, especially in matters such as these." But when Caroline and Pike returned to the Harrow plantation that afternoon, they found Silas loading the last of his belongings into a wagon. His face was thunderous as they approached. "Too late," he said with a bitter smile. "Your precious slaves are long gone, sold downriver to a trader bound for New Orleans. By the time you get your hearing, they'll be cutting cane in Louisiana." Caroline felt the world tilt around her. "You can't. The clerk has issued a stay. The clerk can issue whatever he likes. I answer to higher authority than some small-town bureaucrat." Silas climbed onto his wagon seat and gathered the reins. "Your father's debts are paid in full, with interest. My work here is done." He drove away without looking back, leaving Caroline standing in the dust of her own drive, holding papers that seemed suddenly worthless as last year's corn husks. "We have to follow them," she said, turning to Pike with desperate eyes. "We have to find Isaiah and Lila before—" "Before what, child?" Mrs. Harrow had emerged from the house, her face pale but determined. "Before you throw away what little reputation we have left, before you drag our name through every courthouse and tavern between here and New Orleans. Mama, they were Father's people. His responsibility, our responsibility. They were slaves," Mrs. Harrow said flatly. "Property." to be disposed of as necessity dictates. She held up a paper of her own. Silas has paid the tax debt in full. The West 40 acres are saved. We have a roof over our heads and food on our table. That's what matters. Caroline stared at her mother, as if seeing her for the first time. What matters is honoring Father's last wishes. What matters is doing what's right. What's right is preserving this family and this estate for future generations, not chasing after some romantic notion that will only end in scandal and ruin. Caroline turned away from her mother and looked down the road that led toward the river landing, toward the ferry that would carry Isaiah and Lila into a darkness she couldn't bear to imagine. "Mr. Pike," she said quietly, "will you help me?" The preacher adjusted his hat and picked up his walking stick. "What do you need, child?" "Horses, supplies, and the courage to see this through to the end." Pike nodded. "I think we can manage all three." They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, following the river road that led south toward the ferry landing. Caroline had never traveled so far from home, never been beyond the borders of the county where her family had lived for 3 generations. The world seemed vast and dangerous beyond the familiar boundaries of the plantation. As the sun began to set, storm clouds gathered on the horizon like an army massing for battle. Thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning flickered in the distance. The horses grew nervous, shying at shadows and starting at every sound. "We should find shelter," Pike said, looking up at the darkening sky. "This storm looks to be a bad one." But Caroline pressed on, driven by a desperation that made her reckless. "We're close. I can feel it. They can't be more than a few miles ahead." The first fat raindrops began to fall just as they reached the ferry landing. The river ran dark and swift, swollen with recent rains. On the far bank, Caroline could see the glow of a campfire and the shadowy forms of men moving about. "There," she said, pointing across the water. "That has to be them." Pike squinted through the gathering darkness. "Could be, but how do we get across? The ferry's on the other side, and I don't see the ferryman about." As if summoned by his words, a voice called out across the water. "Ferry's closed for the night. Too dangerous to cross in this weather." Caroline cupped her hands around her mouth and shouted back, "We need passage. It's urgent. Come back in the morning. Ferry runs at first light." The storm broke over them like a wave against a seawall. Rain drove down in sheets, soaking them to the skin in seconds. The wind howled through the trees, bending them almost to the ground. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the churning river in stark detail. "We have to find shelter," Pike shouted over the thunder. "This is too dangerous." But even as he spoke, Caroline noticed something that made her heart race. Across the river, dark figures were moving about the campfire, and one of them, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a familiar grace, could only be Isaiah. "It's them," she said, certainty ringing in her voice. "Pike, it's them." She urged her horse toward the river, but the animal balked, sensing the danger of the rushing water. The current had risen with the storm, turning the crossing into a torrent that could sweep away horse and rider in an instant. "Caroline, no!" Pike caught her horse's bridle, holding her back from the water's edge. "You'll be killed." Behind them, a new sound rose over the storm, the crack of breaking timber and the roar of moving water. Caroline turned to see a wall of brown water rushing down the creek that fed into the main river, carrying trees and debris in its path. "Flash, flood," Pike said grimly. "The whole area will be under water in minutes." Across the river, Caroline could see panic in the camp. Men were shouting and running, trying to move their prisoners to higher ground, but in the darkness and confusion, she lost sight of Isaiah. "We have to help them," she said, tears mixing with rain on her face. "We have to do something." That's when Lila's voice rose over the storm, clear and sweet as a church bell. She was singing the same hymn Caroline had heard her hum in the kitchen, but now the words came clear and strong. "Where the cypress knees bend low in prayer, and the faithful find their crossing there, follow the lantern's dancing light, through the flood and stormy night." Pike's head snapped up, recognition dawning in his eyes. "That's the old river hymn," he said. "The one the ferryman uses to mark the safe crossing when the water's high." Lila's voice continued, weaving through the storm like a golden thread. "When the echo answers thrice, follow wisdom's pure device, step where heaven's mercy flows, where the hidden pathway goes." "She's giving us directions," Caroline realized, telling us where to cross safely. Pike looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. Caroline, that child's been here once, if ever. How could she possibly know? She remembers everything, Caroline said simply. Every song, every story, every scrap of knowledge she's ever heard. If someone told her about the river crossing, she'd remember it perfectly. As if to prove her words, Lila's voice rose again, this time directing them to a grove of ancient cypress trees upstream from the landing. Their massive trunks stood like pillars in the rushing water, creating an eddy where the current was gentler. Caroline dismounted and led her horse toward the trees, following the thread of song that seemed to pull her forward through the storm. The water was cold as winter morning, reaching to her waist and tugging at her skirts. But the cypress roots provided handholds, and the grove's shelter broke the worst of the current. Step by careful step, they made their way across the flooded river. The horses snorted and rolled their eyes, but they trusted their riders enough to follow. Caroline's heart hammered against her ribs as the water rose higher, sometimes reaching her chest, but Lila's voice guided them true. When they finally dragged themselves onto the far bank, gasping and shivering, they found chaos. The patrollers' camp was in ruins, scattered by wind and flood. But in the distance, Caroline could see a group of figures huddled under a rocky overhang, sheltered from the worst of the storm. She ran toward them, her waterlogged skirts hampering every step. And there, in the flickering light of a storm lantern, she saw him. Isaiah stood with his back to the storm, his body shielding Lila from the wind and rain. His chains had been removed, probably, to prevent him from drowning when the flood hit. Jed the patroller sat nearby, looking defeated and thoroughly miserable. "Isaiah!" Caroline called out, her voice barely audible over the storm. He turned, and the look of wonder on his face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "Caroline, what are you doing here?" She threw herself into his arms, not caring about propriety or consequences or anything, but the solid warmth of him against her. "I came to bring you home," she said against his chest. "Both of you." Lila appeared at their side, her blue ribbon somehow still bright despite everything they'd been through. "Miss Caroline, I knew you'd come. I could feel it in the song." "What song, little one?" "The Freedom Song. The one Master Harrow taught me before he died." Lila's eyes shone with something that might have been fever or might have been pure joy. "He said when the time came, the song would show us the way home." Jed struggled to his feet, water dripping from his coat. "Now hold on just a minute. These slaves are bound for New Orleans, storm or no storm. I got papers, forged papers," Caroline said, producing the manumission clause from her coat. "This is my father's true will, legally recorded and properly witnessed. Isaiah and Lila are free." The patroller squinted at the document in the lantern light, his face growing troubled. This changes things." "Yes," Pike said, emerging from the storm like an avenging angel. "It does indeed." But even as hope bloomed in Caroline's chest, she knew their victory was far from complete. They still had to get back across the river, still had to face the legal challenges ahead, and somewhere behind them, Silas was probably already planning his next move. The storm raged on, but in the shelter of the rocky overhang, Caroline held Isaiah's hand and felt the first stirrings of something that might, eventually, become peace. The storm passed before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and strange in the early light. Caroline woke to find herself curled against Isaiah's shoulder, his arm wrapped protective around her while Lila slept curled at their feet. Propriety should have demanded that she move away, but the events of the past days had burned such considerations to ash. Jed the patroller sat by the dead fire, staring at the papers Caroline had shown him. In the growing light, his face looked haggard and uncertain, the easy confidence of the previous day washed away like the storm debris. "Been thinking all night about this business," he said without looking up. "About them papers and seals and such." Pike stirred from his place against the rocks. "And what conclusion have you reached?" "That I've been played for a fool by a man cleverer than I gave him credit for." Jed spat into the ashes. "Silas promised me good money for this job, said it was all legal and proper, but looking at these documents," he shook his head. "I got no stomach for slave stealing, especially when it involves forged papers and children." Caroline felt her heart leap. "Then you'll take us back? You'll testify to what Silas did?" "Reckon I will." Man's got to sleep at night, and I don't fancy spending the rest of my days looking over my shoulder for federal marshals. Jed stood and stretched, his joints popping like kindling. But we got to move fast. Soon as Silas figures out his plan went sideways, he'll be looking to cover his tracks. And that might mean making sure there ain't no witnesses left to tell tales. They made their way back to the river as the sun climbed over the trees, painting the water gold and green. The ferry had been damaged in the storm, but the ferryman had rigged a makeshift crossing using ropes and a flat-bottomed boat. $5 for the lot of you, he said, eyeing their bedraggled group with suspicion. And that's only because I'm feeling charitable after surviving that blow. Caroline paid from the small store of coins she'd brought, watching as Isaiah helped Lila into the boat. The child seemed to glow in the morning light, her ribbon bright as a banner of hope. She'd saved them all with her uncanny memory and her pure, clear voice cutting through the storm. "How did you know about the crossing?" Caroline asked as they poled across the quieter water. "About the cypress trees and the safe passage." Lila smiled, that mysterious expression that made her seem older than her years. "Uncle Benji told me once, when I was carrying water to the fields, he said his daddy helped dig the ferry landing, back when it was first built. Said there was always been a safe place to cross, even in flood times, for them that knew where to look. And the song? Master Harrow taught it to me, the week before he died. Said it was an old river song, older than the ferry, older than the plantation. Said sometimes a song could hold more truth than all the papers in the world." Lila's eyes grew distant. "He was sitting by Mama's grave when he taught it to me. Said he'd been trying to find the courage to do what was right, and that maybe a song could give him the strength he needed." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. Her father, wrestling with his conscience in his final days, had found a way to do right even after death. The song, the manumission clause, the careful placement of evidence where it could be found, all of it planned and provided for, like a father's last gift to children he could not protect in life. They reached the Harrow plantation by midday to find the place in uproar. Missus. Harrow sat on the front porch, flanked by two men Caroline didn't recognize federal marshals. By the look of their badges and bearing, Silas stood before them, his face red with anger and fear. "There," Silas pointed at their approaching group. "That's the patroller I hired, and them's the slaves what was lawfully sold. I don't know what lies they've been telling, but, Mr. Wickham," the taller marshal interrupted, his voice dry as dust, "I think you'd best let us sort this out proper-like." Caroline dismounted and walked toward the porch, her spine straight and her chin lifted. The manumission papers rustled in her coat, and her father's ring caught the sunlight like a promise. "Marshal," she said, her voice carrying the authority she'd been raised to wield. "I'm Caroline Harrow, daughter of the late William Harrow. I believe there's been some confusion about the disposition of certain members of our household." The marshal touched his hat brim. "Miss Harrow, I'm Marshal Thompson, and this is Marshal Wade. We've been investigating reports of irregularities in slave sales throughout this county. Your overseer here has been most helpful in our inquiries." Silas's face went white. "I don't know what you're implying, but what I'm implying," Thompson said mildly, "is that we found your ledger books most interesting reading, particularly the entries regarding sales that seem to have been recorded after the fact, with seals that don't match the supposed signers." He looked at Caroline with sharp eyes. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you, miss?" Caroline produced the papers from her coat, both the forged bill of sale and her father's true manumission clause. "I believe these documents will clarify the situation, Marshal." Thompson examined the papers with the careful attention of a man who'd seen too many forgeries in his career. He held them to the light, compared the seals, studied the handwriting. His partner, Marshal Wade, pulled out a magnifying glass and peered at the wax impressions. "Well, I'll be damned," Wade said softly. "Pardon the language, miss. But this here's a clear case of document fraud if I ever saw one." Silas made a desperate grab for the papers, but Thompson caught his wrist in an iron grip. "I think you've done enough for one day, Mr. Wickham. Matter of fact, I think you've done enough for several lifetimes." "This is outrageous," Silas sputtered. "That girl don't know what she's talking about. Them papers could be forged themselves." "Could be," Thompson agreed. "Except for one small detail." He held up Caroline's hand, where her father's ring gleamed in the sunlight. "This here ring matches the seal on the manumission clause exactly, right down to that little notch in the bird's head." He pressed the ring into the soft wax of a candle that had been burning on the porch rail, creating a perfect impression. "See? Exact match." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Silas's heavy breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Caroline looked at Isaiah, seeing wonder and disbelief warring in his expression. "Does this mean?" he began, but couldn't seem to finish the thought. "Means you're free, son," Thompson said kindly. "You and the little girl both have been since your old master died, if these papers are genuine. Which they appear to be." Lila let out a whoop of joy that startled the horses and sent chickens scattering across the yard. She grabbed Caroline's hand and Isaiah's, dancing between them like a child at Christmas morning. "Free," she sang out. "Free as the birds in the sky, free as the fish in the river, free as the wind in the trees." But even as joy bloomed in Caroline's heart, she saw the fear in her mother's eyes. The way Mrs. Harrow seemed to shrink into herself as the implications of the moment settled over her. "What happens now?" Mrs. Harrow asked, her voice small and uncertain. "What happens to us?" "To the plantation?" Marshall Thompson consulted a leather-bound notebook. "Well, ma'am, seems your overseer here's been running a nice little side business. Forging papers, selling free people into slavery, skimming profits from legitimate sales." He looked at Silas with disgust. "Federal crime, that is. Carries a sentence of 10 to 20 years in prison." Silas slumped, as if the fight had gone out of him all at once. "I was just trying to keep the place afloat," he said weakly. "Time's been hard since the master died. Bills piling up, taxes coming due." "So you thought you'd solve your problems by stealing people's freedom?" Wade's voice could have cut glass. "By forging dead man's papers and trafficking in human misery? I never. I didn't think." Silas's protests died under the marshal's cold stare. Thompson turned back to Caroline. "Now, miss, there's the matter of the debt your father left behind. The tax bill on the West 40 acres was real enough, even if the method of payment was fraudulent." Caroline felt her stomach clench. "How much?" $150, plus interest and penalties. Comes to about 200, all told. It might as well have been 2,000. The plantation had no cash reserves, no ready money to settle such a debt. Caroline looked around the yard at the house her grandfather had built, at the fields her father had worked, at the people whose lives were bound up with this place. "If we can't pay," she asked quietly, "then the county'll have to seize the property for tax sale." Thompson's voice was sympathetic, but firm. "Law's the law, miss. Even when justice gets served, bills still got to be paid." That's when Jed the patroller cleared his throat. "Marshal, if I might have a word?" Thompson looked surprised but nodded. "Speak your piece." "Well, sir, it's like this. I was hired by Wickham here to transport them slaves to New Orleans. Paid me $50 up front, promised another 100 when the job was done." Jed reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. "Now, seeing as how the job was based on forged papers and fraud, I reckon that money belongs to the rightful owners of this plantation." He poured the contents of the pouch into Caroline's hands, 50 silver dollars that gleamed like hope in the afternoon sun. "Moreover," Jed continued, "I heard tell in town that Wickham's been keeping a private account at the bank in Millerville. Money skimmed from plantation sales over the past 2 years. If the marshals was to look into that." Thompson and Wade exchanged glances. "We'll be sure to investigate that thoroughly," Thompson said. "Bank records have a way of revealing interesting patterns." Isaiah stepped forward, his newly freed hands steady as stone. "Miss Caroline, if I might speak?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "I know the books of this place better than anyone, save your daddy and Mr. Thorne. Know where every penny's been spent, every debt incurred, every asset that might be liquidated." He looked around the assembled group. "If you're willing to trust a freed man's word, I believe we can find a way to settle these debts without losing the plantation." "Missus." Harrow stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You would help us? After everything that's been done?" Isaiah met her gaze without flinching. "This place is home to a lot of folks, ma'am. Not just the family in the big house, but the people in the quarters, the tenant farmers, the day laborers. All of us got roots here that go deep. Freeing me and Lila don't change that. Caroline felt something crack open in her chest, like ice breaking on the river in spring. This man, this good, strong, honorable man, was offering to save the very system that had enslaved him, not out of subservience, but out of love for the people it sheltered. What would you propose? Thompson asked, his professional interest clearly piqued. Sale of the timber rights on the back 40, Isaiah said without hesitation. That stand of old-growth oaks worth $300 to the right buyer. Enough to settle the taxes and leave some working capital besides. But that timber was to be my dowry, Caroline said faintly. Isaiah's smile was gentle as morning rain. Some things matter more than dowries, Miss Caroline. Some things matter more than money. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity. Marshals led Silas away in chains, his shoulders bowed with defeat and shame. Mr. Thorne was summoned from the office to verify the plantation's accounts and begin the process of settling debts with found money and timber sales. Reverend Pike stood before the assembled crowd, field hands and house servants, tenant farmers and neighbors who'd come to watch the drama unfold, his voice carrying across the yard like a church bell. Friends, he said, we've witnessed something remarkable today. We've seen justice done and mercy extended. We've seen the bonds of law give way to the bonds of love. Caroline stood beside Isaiah on the front steps, Lila between them like a bridge connecting their lives. Mrs. Harrow sat in her rocking chair, looking frail but peaceful, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Some of you, Pike continued, have asked what changes this day will bring to the Harrow plantation. Will the old ways continue, or will something new take root here? Caroline stepped forward, her father's ring gleaming on her finger like a seal of promise. The old ways are ending, she said, her voice carrying clearly. Not just here, but everywhere. We can cling to them and go down with the ship, or we can build something better from what remains. She looked around the crowd, meeting eyes both black and white, free and enslaved. This plantation will continue to operate, but differently. Those who choose to stay will work for wages, fairly paid. Those who choose to leave will go with our blessing and whatever help we can provide. A murmur ran through the crowd, excited and uncertain. Changes were coming whether they welcomed them or not. At least here they could help shape what those changes looked like. And what of you, Miss Caroline? Called out one of the neighboring planters. What of your personal situation? Caroline felt her cheeks burn, but she lifted her chin and spoke the truth that lived in her heart. Isaiah is a free man now. Free to stay or go as he chooses, free to make his own decisions about his life. She paused, gathering her courage. And if he chooses to stay, if he chooses to build a life with me, then he'll do so as an equal partner, not as property or chattel. The silence that followed was thick as molasses, heavy with shock and scandal and possibility. Then Lila's clear voice cut through the tension like a blade. She kissed him, the child announced matter-of-factly, kissed him right in front of God and everybody. And nothing terrible happened. Sky didn't fall, world didn't end. Just love getting itself spoken out loud where folks could hear it. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. Pike smiled and raised his hands for attention. Love, he said, is the strongest force in creation. Stronger than law, stronger than custom, stronger than the fear that keeps us apart. He looked at Caroline and Isaiah with warm approval. If these two young people choose to bind their lives together, who are we to stand against the workings of Providence? Mrs. Harrow struggled to her feet, leaning heavily on her walking stick. The crowd fell silent, waiting to hear what the widow would say about her daughter's shocking choices. She approached Caroline slowly, her steps measured and careful. When she reached the spot where her daughter stood, she stopped and looked into Caroline's eyes for a long moment. Your father, she said finally, would be proud of the woman you've become, proud of the courage you've shown, the principles you've upheld. She reached out and touched Caroline's cheek with a trembling hand. And perhaps he would understand the choice you've made. Caroline caught her mother's hand and pressed it to her face. Mama, I told you once not to kiss a slave, Mrs. Harrow said, her voice growing stronger. To think of our name, of our reputation. She looked around the crowd, meeting the eyes of neighbors and servants alike. Well, I've been thinking about our name. about what it means, what it's worth. She straightened her shoulders and spoke with the authority of a woman born to command. The Harrow name will stand for something new from this day forward. It will stand for justice over tradition, for mercy over pride, for love over law. She turned to Isaiah and extended her hand. "Welcome to the family, son." Isaiah took her hand in both of his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll do my best to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me." "You already have," Mrs. Harrow said simply. Reverend Pike stepped forward, his Bible open in his hands. "If there are no objections," he said, looking around the assembled crowd, "I'd like to offer a blessing on this union. Not a wedding ceremony that will come later, with proper preparation and celebration, but a blessing to sanctify what's already been declared in both word and deed." No voice rose in protest. Even the neighboring planters, scandalized as they might be, held their tongues in the face of such determination. Pike placed one hand on Caroline's shoulder and one on Isaiah's. "Lord," he said, his voice carrying across the yard like a hymn, "bless these your children who have chosen love over fear, truth over convenience, justice over comfort. Make their union a beacon of hope in a world that needs your light." As he spoke, Leela began to hum the freedom song that had guided them through the storm. Other voices joined her, first the house servants, then the field hands, then even some of the white folks in the crowd. The melody rose and fell like breathing, weaving through Pike's words and around the people gathered in the yard. When the blessing was finished, Caroline turned to Isaiah and kissed him again, not with the desperate defiance of their first kiss, but with the quiet certainty of a woman who had counted the cost and found it worth paying. The sun was setting by the time the crowd began to disperse, painting the sky red and gold above the plantation house. Caroline stood on the front steps with Isaiah's hand warm in hers, watching their neighbors drive away into the gathering dusk. "What happens now?" she asked, suddenly uncertain in the face of all the changes ahead. "Now," Isaiah said, his voice steady and sure, "we build something new, something that honors the good in what came before, while leaving room for what's yet to come." Lila appeared at their side, her blue ribbon bright in the lamplight that spilled from the house. "Going to be a fine adventure," she said with the confidence of a child who had already seen miracles unfold. "Yes, indeed, a fine adventure for us all." And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Caroline thought she could see the shape of that adventure, beginning to form, uncertain and difficult, perhaps, but bright with possibility and rich with hope. The air on the Harrow porch feels strangely wide and light, as if the very atmosphere has learned to breathe differently since the day of the great settling. Caroline rocks gently in her mother's chair, watching the road that leads away from the plantation toward whatever future awaits them all. In the yard below, a wagon waits under the spreading oak tree, its canvas cover gleaming white in the dusk. The horses stand patient in their traces, well fed and rested, ready for the night journey that will carry them north by stages toward a town where free black families are said to live without fear, where papers matter more than prejudice, where the Fugitive Slave Act is honored more in the breach than in the observance. Isaiah emerges from the house, a leather satchel in one hand and a rolled document in the other. The document bears Marshall Thompson's official seal, a certificate of freedom that no man can dispute, no law can overturn. His name is written there in careful script: Isaiah Thomas, free man, age 26, formerly enslaved, now citizen. Mr. Thorne finished the books, he tells Caroline, settling into the chair beside her. Timber sale went through clean, taxes paid in full, with enough left over to hire proper wages for harvest time. Caroline nods, her attention split between his words and the gentle motion of Lila, who sits on the top step with the family Bible open across her knees. The child reads slowly but surely, her finger tracing each line of scripture as if committing it to memory for some future need. "And the workers?" Caroline asks. "Most are staying. Uncle Benji says he's too old to start over somewhere new, but he wants wages for his work from now on. Aunt Dinah's teaching the young ones to read and cipher. Says if they're going to be free, they need to be smart about it." Mrs. Harrow appears in the doorway, moving more easily than she has in months. The healing of her pride, it seems, has done wonders for her constitution. She carries a wooden box in her hands, a wedding chest that belonged to Caroline's grandmother, carved with roses and fitted with brass hinges that still gleam despite their age. "For your journey," she says, setting the box beside Caroline's chair. "It contains your grandmother's dishes, her silver, and a few other things a young wife might find useful." She pauses, her voice growing soft. "Also your father's letters to me, from when we were courting. I thought you might like to read them someday, to understand the kind of love that builds rather than destroys." Caroline reaches for her mother's hand. "Thank you, Mama, for everything. I should be thanking you, child. You showed me what our name could mean when it's attached to something worthy. Mrs." Harrow looks at Isaiah with clear, untroubled eyes. Take care of her, son. She's got her father's stubborn streak and her grandmother's talent for getting into trouble. Isaiah's smile is gentle as lamplight. "I'll do my best, ma'am, though I suspect she's better at taking care of herself than you might think." Reverend Pike's buggy turns into the drive, its wheels crunching on the gravel. He's brought the county clerk with him, Mr. Mallory, looking nervous and official in his Sunday coat. Behind them comes a second buggy carrying the Quaker couple who will guide the first part of their journey north, their plain clothes and quiet manner marking them as people of conviction rather than convenience. "Time, I think," Pike says as he climbs down from his buggy. The moon's rising, and night travel is safest when the roads are empty. Caroline stands and smooths her traveling dress, a practical brown wool that will serve her well on the journey ahead. She's packed light, taking only what she truly needs: her father's ring, her mother's blessing, and the courage that love has given her to walk away from everything she's ever known. Lila closes the Bible with a soft thump and stands to face the assembled group. She's grown in these past weeks, not just in height but in presence, as if freedom has unlocked something bright and powerful inside her small frame. "Got something to say," she announces, her voice clear and strong. "Something Master Harrow told me the night before he died." The adults fall silent, drawn by the gravity in her tone. "He said the hardest thing about dying wasn't leaving this world behind. It was not knowing whether the seeds he'd planted would take root and grow." Lila looks around the circle of faces, her eyes bright with tears and starlight. "Well, I want to tell him, wherever he's listening, that the seeds grew just fine. Grew into something beautiful and strong, something that's going to spread and flourish in places he never dreamed." She steps forward and takes Caroline's hand, then reaches for Isaiah's, linking them together like a chain of hope. "We're free," she says simply. "All of us. Free to love, free to choose, free to build something better than what came before." She looks up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "And that's worth singing about." Her voice rises in the freedom song that has become their anthem, the melody that guided them through storm and struggle to this moment of quiet triumph. The others join her, their voices blending in harmony that seems to lift toward heaven itself. "Mrs." Harrow takes her place beside Aunt Dinah, not as mistress to servant but as woman to woman, two mothers who have learned to see past the barriers that once divided them. Uncle Benji leans against the porch rail, his weathered face peaceful in the lamplight. The tenant farmers who have chosen to stay gather in the yard, their children playing quietly among the wagon wheels. As the last notes of the song fade into the warm night air, Isaiah helps Caroline into the wagon. She settles onto the wooden seat beside the Quaker woman, who introduces herself as Sister Sarah. The woman's eyes are kind, her voice gentle as she speaks of safe houses and friendly churches, of conductors and stations along the railroad that carries souls to freedom. Lila climbs into the wagon bed, her small hands clutching both her blue ribbon and the leather satchel that contains their freedom papers. She nestles between bundles of supplies and wedding gifts, looking like a bright-eyed bird ready to take flight. Isaiah swings up beside the Quaker man, who will drive them through the first leg of their journey. "Brother Thomas," he's called, and he knows the roads and rivers between here and freedom like a sailor knows the stars. "Ready?" he asks, gathering the reins. Caroline looks back at the plantation house, its windows glowing warm in the darkness. This is goodbye, perhaps forever, to the only home she's ever known. But as she watches her mother stand straighter on the porch, as she sees the hope in the faces of the people who remain behind, she knows they're leaving something good in their wake. "Ready," she says. The wagon rolls down the drive and onto the road, wheels marking time on the packed earth. Behind them, The light from the porch grows smaller but never disappears entirely, a beacon in the darkness that speaks of home and hope and the courage to choose love over fear. In the distance, thunder rumbles across the sky, but this time it carries no threat, only the promise of rain to water the seeds they've planted, to nourish the new growth that will spring from ground they've prepared with their tears and their faith. Lila's voice rises one last time in the freedom song, joined now by Isaiah's deep bass and Caroline's clear soprano, harmonizing with the night wind and the wagon wheels and the steady beat of hoofbeats, carrying them toward tomorrow. And if you listen carefully in the spaces between the notes, you can hear it still, the echo of that first brave kiss, the sound of chains falling, the whispered promise of a name redeemed and a love that conquered fear.